What I'm going to say in this video will surprise many of you who have heard me preach at length about the need to take Jesus more literally and to follow him today in the same way that the early Christians did in Bible times. Nevertheless, there are some things which really are quite fundamentally different today, and there are others which will be different in the near future. Some of these differences are already making it virtually impossible to survive in the ways that Jesus and his first followers survived. I want to address that in this video. But to begin with, let's start by looking at some of the ways that Jesus did survive, both in practical terms and in terms of assistance from his heavenly Father when he walked the earth. Some people have made extreme assumptions about Jesus living like any rich preacher you might find in the world today. Whether that meant he was running a carpentry business and preaching on the weekends, or whether it meant that he was holding big meetings day after day with huge collection plates to rake in funds for himself and his disciples. But the biblical record does not support any of that. The only record of anyone even calling Jesus a carpenter was that of an opponent. He knew from the time he was 12 years old what his father's real business was. And the only collection plates that are mentioned in the Gospels are the baskets he passed around after he had fed a huge congregation instead of them feeding him. But if you keep listening, a little later, I'm going to suggest one way in which his feeding of the 5,000 may not have been so opposite as it first appears to be. At the very least, we know that Jesus did use money. It's just that he taught his followers not to work for it. He said the ultimate spiritual choice is going to be over whether we choose to work for God or whether we choose to work for money and all that money can buy, mammon, as the King James Bible calls it. But Jesus did, nevertheless, use money. We know this because there is reference in the Gospels to Judas having the job of treasurer. Jesus apparently gave Judas instructions from time to time to take money from a money bag which he carried around with him and to give it to certain needy people. There's also reference to Judas having abused this position as treasurer. Judas apparently often sneaked money from the bag for his own selfish purchases. Nevertheless, there was a bag, and it did hold money. So, how did the funds get into the bag? There's one reference to a miraculous appearance of money inside a fish, which Jesus had told Peter to catch. In other words, Peter simply found some money when it was needed, even though it only happened because he was in the right place at the right time in obedience to Jesus. Still, I consider that to be miraculous. At the same time, I think most people would assume that this was an exceptional case. He didn't just choof off to the pier each night to pick up another gold coin from another fish. In the 8th chapter of Luke's Gospel, we get a picture of how it probably happened most of the time. This chapter specifically mentions a few women who travel around with Jesus and, quote, ministered to him from their substance. See, they apparently had unbelieving husbands who allowed them to donate to Jesus from the family budget. It would have probably represented very little cash for such a large group of people, but it was something. And if these women supported what Jesus did, there may have been others. There's no mention of Jesus fundraising or taking a collection, but there must have been people who simply volunteered things, like food and clothes, if not money. There's nothing to indicate that Jesus taught people to do this, or even that he felt he needed such support. But it's still quite likely that it happened from time to time. There are also accounts of Jesus and his disciples being guests for meals at the homes of people whom they met. So that was another way that God would have provided for his needs and the needs of his disciples, whether the host was a Pharisee by the name of Simon, or Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. There were other one-off situations that may have brought in larger amounts of money. When Jesus told people to sell what they had and give to the poor, there seems to be little doubt that he and his followers were amongst those to whom the people gave. Certainly in the book of Acts, the first Christians saw no difference to what Jesus taught and what they did with their funds. The Bible says they gave the proceeds from the sale of their goods to the apostles, and it was the apostles who shared the wealth amongst all those who had needs, presumably inside the community as well as outside. So, on what did they spend the money that they received from people who forsook all that they owned? They apparently spent it mostly on basic necessities, food and clothes, both for themselves and for others. But there was also a house in Capernaum where Peter's wife and mother-in-law lived. Although Jesus talked about not having a place to sleep as a general rule, certainly from time to time he and his whole gang would stop over at this house in Capernaum. Peter remarks at one point that he and the others had sold everything they owned to follow Jesus, so it doesn't seem likely that Peter would have owned that house in Capernaum, but he probably rented it. And the rent payments may have come out of what they had received from some other house that Peter owned or from a house that some other disciple sold. Now, I want to go back to the 5,000 and Jesus' feeding of them. It's interesting that this is the only event in the life of Jesus prior to the week when he was crucified that all four of the gospel writers felt was worth mentioning. A couple of them even say that it had happened more than once. Special interest in this miracle is understandable if you remember that the first Christians did the same thing that Jesus and his 12 apostles did. They left their homes and they left their jobs and they set out preaching the good news of the kingdom of heaven by going into all the world. Knowing that they served a master who was able to miraculously feed thousands of people in the middle of nowhere would have been a key ingredient in their outstanding faith. Like the miraculous appearance of manna on the ground every morning in the wilderness, as recorded in the Old Testament, loaves and fishes were a pretty powerful demonstration of God's ability to take care of his children. But there's something else that is special about the feeding of 5,000, besides the fact that all four evangelists recorded it. And that is that we're not given any clue as to what it looked like for those who looked on. Did Jesus drop the loaves and fishes on the ground and they suddenly turned into this huge pile of tuna fish sandwiches? Did they break off a piece of bread only to have the loaf grow a new piece each time they handed it out, over and over for thousands of times? Did they carry it hidden in a bag, which always had more when they reached back in? In other words, did anyone see loaves and fishes actually appearing out of nowhere? It just seems like someone in all that crowd would have witnessed one fish becoming two fish, or half a fish becoming a whole fish over and over again. But there's no mention of it. We're left to guess what actually happened between Jesus blessing the bread and there being 12 baskets of leftovers at the end of the meal. Now there's another interpretation which is totally consistent with what we're told in the Bible. Please understand, I totally believe in God's miraculous provision, but I also understand that sometimes, like when Peter bowled up a fish with a coin inside it, there may be a natural explanation as well for how the coin got there in the first place. Now think about this. All these thousands of people heading off into the wild to hear what Jesus had to say. They may have had little thought for how he was going to feed the others as the day wore on, but human nature is such that they would have almost certainly grabbed something for themselves on the way out the door. And as the crowd grew, it would have become more and more awkward to pull that food out and set up a picnic spread for their family while everyone else sat around with nothing to eat. So maybe people were hoarding what they had, waiting for a chance to be alone and devour it themselves without feeling guilty about eating in front of others who had nothing. I think it could have been like the classic story about stone soup. Have you heard it? Where a village was close to starving because people had nothing to eat, and a stranger suggests they put on a pot of water so he can make soup from a magic stone that he carries in his pocket. And that was when someone reported they had a few vegetables left which they could add to the soup. And someone else contributes potatoes, onions, a little meat turns up. Little by little, people bring out all that they have, and surprise, surprise, there's enough for everyone. It's often like that with God. He looks for just one little boy who's willing to open up and share all that he has with everyone else, before such generosity inspires others to open their coat and pull out a loaf of bread that they had been hiding, or to reach into a bag hanging on their shoulder and bring out a couple more fish. Now let's just suppose that this was part of how the 5,000 were fed. And let us suppose it's part of how the 12 apostles each ended up with a basket full of leftovers at the end of the day. The generosity and faith of that one lad who shared his lunch inspired others to share as well. And the result was enough to not only feed the multitude, but also to keep the apostles going for a few more meals after that. Now, if this is not what happened out there in the wilderness, we do know that something similar happened at other times when the disciples were walking through fields. They did what is called gleaning, picking up some of the leftover wheat and eating some of the leftover corn. This practice was common in Bible times. Just by using what society did not use, they were able to stay alive. But here is where we need to retrace our steps and compare what happened then with what is happening in our world today. And here is where I say that things are changing in such a way now that a lot of this won't work anymore. At least it won't work in a few years' time. In Bible times, it was written into the law that farmers were to leave a little bit of the crop lying on the ground to be used by the poor. It was a charitably calculated waste. By contrast, we have in our greedy, materialistic, affluent society incredible waste. Literally tons of unused food that is thrown out by grocery stores every day. More than enough to literally feed millions of people. A whole counterculture has sprung up called freegans, who have capitalized on this waste and shown that people can, without even any faith in God, grow fat on what society throws away. But what has been the result of the publicity that such waste has generated? Grocery stores everywhere are now locking their bins, poisoning the food, employing guards, and installing huge, incredibly expensive trash compactors, which will crush the food before it ever reaches the public eye. Why should anyone be allowed to get food for free when the markets exist for the express purpose of making a profit out of your hunger? Some of us are still able to live, and to live quite well, off the waste that is not locked away yet. But it is getting harder in a greedy and a corrupt world. And there are other developments which would offer a greater challenge to Jesus and his little band of ruffians today. Regulations make it almost criminal to help the poor in some places, with so-called health regulations being used as an excuse for corporate bosses to restrict charity to a very short list of officially recognized agencies. All around the world, whole countries are starting to go cashless, so that someone walking down the street now is incapable of handing a coin to a beggar anymore. And the world is quickly moving toward a time when it will take a form of microchipped identification to get a meal at a charity soup kitchen. We are moving toward a day when it will not only be impossible to buy or sell without a mark in your right hand or in your forehead, but it will be impossible to donate to a church, to a charity, or even to a beggar on the street without such a mark. Do you see why I say that the doors which were open to Jesus may not be available to us today? Or at least they may not be available anymore in the very near future. So what does it mean in practical terms for anyone who wants to literally obey Jesus today? Does it mean we have to take the mark? Certainly, that conclusion is consistent with the conclusion that so-called Christians everywhere have made for centuries. Times are different now, we say. The kind of faith that the first Christians had won't work today. Isn't that what we say? It won't work in the modern world. But the warning was there in the prophecy about the mark of the beast some 2,000 years ago. We were being told to count the cost. We were told that it was going to come down eventually to a life and death choice between faith in God and faith in money. Jesus didn't say, sell what you have and come live in a big house like me. He didn't say, quit your job and come feast with me. Sure, some of these things were there, and some are still there today. Jesus was famous for having feasted at times, but he said it would not last forever. There would come a time, he said, when we will fast, of necessity. The bottom line in what Jesus said to would-be followers in Luke 14 was this: whoever does not take up his cross and deny himself, forsaking his own life even, is not worthy of me. The cross, brothers and sisters, the cross. It's what he asks us to take up. Do you know what that means? Have you counted that cost? Paul called it the foolishness of preaching the cross. Jesus said that he lived in a spiritually green tree by comparison to what it is like today. But even in that green tree, he was crucified. 10 of his 12 disciples were martyred for their faith. Can we expect anything easier than that in this dry, dead tree that represents the world today? Are we to be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through stormy seas? Take up your cross. What does it mean? It may mean starving to death. But for some of us, we're finding that we can reach the lost in a way that we never could have before, just by stepping out now, before the mark comes, and living as thousands of early Christians did, taking advantage of the waste in a decadent world, for as long as the door remains open, in order to preach the gospel in all the world as Jesus has told us to do. And then, he promised, the end shall come. Come with us. Discover the blessed presence of God, not only in his daily provision, but in his comfort and hope of a better life when our end comes in this world. Gleaning may be cut off. Donations may be restricted to servants of the Antichrist. Generosity may dry up. But one way or another, God will provide for his people if we'll step out now and learn to trust him while it's still relatively easy to do so. The Bible tells us that some of us will be provided for miraculously in the wilderness, like the children of Israel were, and like the multitudes whom he fed with loaves and fishes were. But the Bible also tells us that many more of us will die, possibly because we're sick or injured, but without medical treatment, possibly starving to death, possibly freezing to death, possibly executed by an evil regime. His miraculous provision will be there for some, but according to the revelation itself, it will not be there for most of us. Nevertheless, white robes will be given to all of them as God sorts out his saints, dividing his obedient sheep from the rebellious goats. Please contact us today if you want to be part of this mighty move of God in these last days of mankind's madness. Amen.